Hello YouTube, this is Garrett House, aka Garrett OS, aka Garrettos, and today I'm presenting on Joe Rogan's personality type in the MBTI system. I think he's an ESFP. So in this video I'll be going over who Joe Rogan is, in case you're not familiar with him, what an ESFP is, in case you're not familiar with that personality type, as well as why I think Joe Rogan is an ESFP in the MBTI system. So, who is Joe Rogan? Well, he's a self-described mixed martial arts fanatic, stand-up comic, host of the Joe Rogan Experience podcast, and psychedelic adventurer. And what we'll see by the end of this video is how each of these four aspects of his personality map onto four aspects of his ESFP personality type in the MBTI system. Now we can start getting into what is an ESFP, starting with this type's dichotomies. So, E stands for extroverted, S stands for sensation, F stands for feeling, P stands for perceiving. I'm not going to get into the meanings or definitions of these dichotomies specifically because this isn't what I'm going to be using to type Joe Rogan in this presentation, but there's plenty of resources for understanding more about these dichotomies online if you're curious. So these are the cognitive functions of the ESFP in the MBTI system, also known as their cognitive function stack. Without getting into the details of what each of these functions look like or what these concepts mean, which I'll get into at a later part in this video, their first cognitive function is extroverted sensation, their second cognitive function is introverted feeling, their third cognitive function is extroverted thinking, and their fourth cognitive function is introverted intuition. So this is the framework I used to type Rogan. I broke his life up into quarters and assigned a dominant cognitive function to each of the quarters. Essentially, he was doing something different each quarter of his life. He integrated the prior quarters into each current quarter's activity, but there was always something new he found, discovered, or got into at each quarter. And what we're going to see is that each of these interests that spiked at each of his quarters aligns very nicely with the cognitive function stack of an ESFP. So I see Joe Rogan's first quarter is primarily described by extroverted sensation because during his first quarter, he was a very successful Taekwondo practitioner. I see this as a manifestation of his extroverted sensation function for the following three reasons. It's irrational as opposed to rational. Taekwondo is sensory as opposed to intuitive, as well as extroverted as opposed to introverted. Taekwondo is irrational essentially because it's not involving the linguistic manipulation of languages or concepts. It's more of a physical, in this case, manifestation of activity. It's sensory because you're literally imparting sensations into other people when you attack them or block their attacks. And it's extroverted because there's somebody else there. It's not just you, which is what we'll see with his next quarter activity. But in the case of Taekwondo being extroverted sensation, it is extroverted sensation because it is irrational, sensory, and extroverted activity. Now we move into Joe Rogan's second quarter where he begins to focus on stand-up comedy. Why is stand-up comedy introverted feeling? Aside from the fact that it's artistic, emotional, expressive, and thus introverted feeling by colloquial or conventional standards of the definition of introverted feeling, it's introverted feeling more so because it's a rational feeling and introverted activity. It's rational because it's linguistic as opposed to visual, pictorial, or kinesthetic or physical. It's feeling as opposed to thinking because it is emotionally laden language as opposed to dry, clinical, logical language that you're expressing. And it's introverted as opposed to extroverted because firstly, you're the only person on stage, and secondly, because you're the person who came up with the material. You're not copying or parroting back something somebody else came up with, and you're doing it alone as opposed to in interaction with another person. Sure, there's a crowd there, but unless you're doing crowd work, it's mostly just you up on stage alone, presenting material that you came up with. So now we move into Joe Rogan's third quarter, which is characterized by his activity as a broadcaster. Essentially, this is extroverted thinking because it's rational thinking and extroverted activity. So why is this broadcasting rational as opposed to irrational? Well, because like with stand-up, it's linguistic as opposed to visual, pictorial, or physical or visceral. He's dealing with language as opposed to abstract or visual data. It's thinking because this rational linguistic activity is now no longer aimed at eliciting emotional reactions in other people as much as it is aimed at getting the truth of the matter out of these people and into the public consciousness. It's about figuring out the logic behind people's perceptions and their awareness and trying to make that more well known. And lastly, it's extroverted because he's always across the table from somebody interviewing them. It's not just his perspective anymore. He's engaging with other people in order to figure out how they think. So fourth quarter, right? This is when we have to get more speculative because Joe Rogan is still in his third quarter of life. But I think this fourth quarter for him is going to be more characterized by psychedelic exploration. He already talks about this with DMT and stuff, and I see this as a manifestation of his introverted intuition function. Why? Because it's irrational, intuitive, and introverted activity. Essentially, psychedelics are irrational because you're not really experiencing verbal activity at that point. It's more, at least the psychedelics that Joe Rogan is partial to, it's more about pictures and images and abstract feelings and things that can't really be expressed in words. He says this much when he talks about these experiences he's had on psychedelics. And why is it intuitive? Well, because it's abstract and imaginative. These images aren't of reality, they're of something else. And it's introverted because it's cooked up inside of your own head, just like with stand-up, except with this time, it's pictures as opposed to words. So that's the presentation on the MBTI personality type of Joe Rogan. This last slide is essentially just a slide I pulled from his website, where this is kind of what kind of tipped me off in this whole direction of just, stand-up comedy, psychedelics, podcasting, as well as martial arts, because he says as much about himself on his website. And I kind of looked through his life and saw, oh yeah, all this stuff lines up with ESFP. Only other thing I'd say is that I know that these are some non-conventional definitions that I use, but these are what work for me. I don't speak for the entire type community when I make these videos or when I make these conclusions, but this is just what makes sense for me about typology. Lastly, thank you for watching, and if you feel so inclined, please like and subscribe, and maybe even start a conversation about what you liked and what you didn't like about the video in the comments below. Have a nice day, and I'll see you next time.